Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Francophile Reader. So today I would like to talk about L'amour, la Fantasia by Assia Djebar. Assia Djebar, which is actually a pen name, is considered one of the greatest female Algerian writers of the 20th century, and L'amour, la Fantasia, which in English is titled Fantasia, an Algerian Cavalcade, is considered one of her greatest novels. This book explores two periods of warfare, the first being the 1840s conquest of Algeria by the French, and the second, the Algerian Revolution, which ended in 1962. This book particularly explores the experiences of women during these two time periods, and some of the chapters deal with the author's own experience growing up during the Algerian Revolution. So what I would like to do is convince you to try Assia Djebar's works, particularly L'amour, la Fantasia. I want to bring out some important details, at least from the first half of the novel, and hopefully this will convince you to try this book. It is challenging, but I think it is well worth the effort, especially if you're interested in intersectional feminism and post-colonial studies. What is a fantasia? So we all know what a fantasy is, but a fantasia is a particular musical style. And what Wikipedia says is that a fantasia is, quote, a musical composition with its roots in the art of improvisation. Oxford says that it is a thing composed of a mixture of different forms and styles. I think that the Oxford definition is particularly appropriate for talking about this book because this novel is a mixture of voices, of periods, of cultures, and of languages. This is about the intersection of identities and of stories. So that is the Fantasia part of the title. And then there is the amour, or love, part of the title, because the French title, L'amour, la Fantasia, means love, Fantasia. Beginning in medieval literature, l'amour is often coupled with la mort, which means death. So love and death are this couplet of words that appear in French literature beginning in the Middle Ages all the way through to the modern era. And Assia Djebar certainly assumes that her reader would be making these connections. And in a book that is all about war, violence against women, violence against people of different cultures, this is certainly the case. Love here, of course, has to do with romantic love, but also love for one's people, whether love for one's people leads to violence against another group, or whether love encourages people to join in a revolution against their oppressor. The word that comes to mind when I think of Assia Djebar's novel is métissage. Métissage means the mixing of cultures. It means diversity. So since this is a fantasia, what are the various threads that make up this tapestry? I've listed a few. The first are the archival accounts of the colonization of Algeria in the 1840s. Chroniclers who talk about what happened, usually almost always from the first perspective of the French, especially since they are written in French. But also of generals who led the expeditions and the massacres. So these are stories that are told from the perspective of the oppressor, and Assia Djebar tries to think of what they might mean for those who are oppressed. Also, what might the oppressed survivors know about this history that we might not find in the French accounts? Another thread are women who witnessed the colonization and were essentially bought and sold as prizes by the French, but also by other Algerian men. There is an emir who has won a particular battle. He will choose a woman to be his wife, and the woman doesn't have a say in it. There's, of course, the 1950s Algerian Revolution, and the women who were involved in the revolution on the side of what are called the frères, the brothers, or the mujahideen, the freedom fighters. You have Assia Djebar's own story growing up. She's about 14, 15, I think 14 to 17, I would say, growing up as a fairly privileged Algerian girl. During the Algerian Revolution, her father was a teacher. We learned this from the opening scene of the book, and she was educated in French schools. In fact, Assia Djebar was one of the first women I think one of the first Muslims to graduate from an École Normale Supérieure, which is like the Ivy League of France. So she was very, very educated, and education is a huge theme in this book. A lot of this novel explores words and who has the power to tell their story and how education empowers people. And then finally, the final thread that I could discern, there may be many more, are widows of the Algerian War who are sharing their own stories, again, either as women who were involved in the revolution or those who were just victims of the violence occurring. There'll be stories of the Mujahideen who occupy these women's homes, and then they become victims alongside the brothers when the French attack. So some people are a part of the revolution even when they don't necessarily want to be. Assia Djebar reminds the reader that Algeria was never monocultural or monolingual. There are 3 major languages that are explored here, although this novel is entirely written in French, and that is a choice that Assia Djebar makes, and she does talk about this choice, the 3 languages being Berber, Arabic, and French. As I suggested, the incipit, or the opening scene of the book, shows Assia Djebar, or the je, the I of the narrative, as a young girl holding the hand of her father as she is going to a French school. So I will put the French on the screen and I will read you the English translation. The English translation is by Dorothy S. Blair. A little Arab girl going to school for the first time. One autumn morning, walking hand in hand with her father, a tall, erect figure in a fez and a European suit, carrying a bag of school books. He is a teacher of the French primary school. A little Arab girl in a village in the Algerian Sahel. So already from the opening scene, we see this blending of cultures and languages. The father who's dressed in a fez and a European suit. The little Arab girl who is going to a French school. But then it is very jarring because while we begin with the third person perspective, we're suddenly thrust into the first person perspective as the author talks about herself at the age of 17, having received a letter from some man she had been communicating with through correspondence, and her father finds the letter and tears it apart. So here we see this clash of cultures again, where while on the one hand Assia Djebar gets French schooling, as we will see later on in the novel, she doesn't necessarily have the same opportunities or the same freedoms when it comes to her love life as her white French friends did. Assia Djebar is playing here also with style, because the beginning of the novel is like an Orientalist painting. Orientalism is the Western gaze on the East. It's both a romanticization of Eastern cultures, but also the demonization of those same cultures. The beginning of the novel gives you the impression that that is what Assia Djebar is going for. But quickly it becomes clear that she's going to challenge these narratives. The cover of the novel is in fact one of these Orientalist paintings. It's called Rebecca Kidnapped by a Templar during the sack of the castle of Front-de-Bœuf by Eugène de la Croix, who painted a lot of Orientalist paintings in the 19th century. We get chapters about 3 anonymous sisters, 3 anonymous Algerian sisters who are forced to remain at home because women are either under the protection of their father or they're under the protection of their husbands, whereas their French female friends are allowed to come and go as they please. And in one scene, one of the French girls, is kissing her boyfriend in front of her father, who is an officer, and the father doesn't even look up from the newspaper he's reading. And it's these kind of moments that really show how complicated female identity is in Algeria, where on the one hand, there's this desire for Algerian sovereignty, and yet on the other hand, there's this feeling of jealousy that the French women have more freedom than the Muslim Algerian women. A big thing in this novel is what the author chooses to hold back. What the author chooses to not disclose can often be just as important as what she does disclose. And not just only her, but any of the women whose voices we hear in the story, or the oppressor who tells the account of these massacres that are sometimes described in great detail. Assia Djebar reclaims some of these stories by paradoxically thanking Pélissier, who was one of the generals involved in what was essentially a genocide of a Berber tribe, thanking him, not of course because of what he did, Assia Djebar herself being Berber ethnically, but because he told the story of what happened. And so because of him, we know for a fact, we have evidence that these people existed and that their village, their community was destroyed. Whereas there was another general named Saint-Arnaud who decided not to disclose what happened. And in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a German scholar who suggested, German or French, I think French scholar, who suggested that then this massacre never happened. Thankfully, they found a letter that Saint-Arnaud wrote to his brother, where, probably to assuage his guilty conscience, he admits that this happened and that he tried to hide the information. It really reminded me of why it's so important that we have Holocaust museums and, the Never Again movement. Because this evidence, often coming from Nazis who took pictures of everything they did, videos of everything they did, it's because of their evidence that we have photo proof of what happened. And it becomes this important part of Jewish memory, and also a reminder that this atrocity happened. Otherwise, people can just say, oh, it's a myth. Oh, it never really happened. And so Assia Djebar thanks Pélissier because of him and because of his account, we have evidence that these people once existed and were destroyed. There are some disturbing lines in this book, as when the captain Montagnac describes a battle to his uncle in these words: "This little fray offered a charming spectacle. Clouds of horsemen, light as birds, crisscrossing, flitting in every direction, and from time to time the majestic voice of the cannon rising above the shouts of triumph and the rifle shots. All this combined to present a delightful panorama and an exhilarating scene." This book is simultaneously beautiful in its prose. In fact, much of it is written in prose poetry, and just horrifying in the events that are recounted. Even though Pélissier stood by what he did, the way that he justifies his violence is very striking. These operations, Field Marshal, are such as one undertakes when obliged to do so, but one prays to God that one will never again have to carry them out. So of course Pélissier is horrified, but what he feels he had to do. He was just following orders. He was pressed against the wall. He had to kill all of these people. Basically, they would detonate all the caves in which women, children, men, cattle, everybody was just staying there, and he would just kill them all. This is a really hard book to read. It is hard on a literary level. It is hard in its subject matter. And it's also hard because at times I felt that this book isn't written for a Western audience. This book assumes a knowledge of history, of Algerian history, and figures of Algerian history that at least I certainly didn't have, and I don't know how many French would actually have that background. So she really makes you work for your knowledge. I really do hope to read more by Assia Djebar. Evidently, this was the first book in a quartet, and I really do want to read the other 3 books in this series if she wrote the other 3 books. On book 2, we talk a lot about intersectionalism and intersectional feminism, and we're starting to talk about, we talk about white supremacy. Colonialism has, of course, a history in the non-Anglophone world. People of North African descent in France are disenfranchised. They live in terrible neighborhoods, their education is just subpar, and they face police violence. I really do hope to make more videos about Algeria and other North African countries, as well as talking about the experience of people from the Maghreb in France, and also Muslims in France, because of course those two aren't necessarily the same thing. So yeah, let me know if you've ever read anything by Assia Djebar, if there are other Algerian authors you would recommend to me, particularly female Algerian authors, and I will talk to you tomorrow when I make my next video on Notre Dame de Paris. I hope that you are having a wonderful week, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.